Have you ever sat down to write the method chapter of your thesis or dissertation and felt like you were supposed to justify every decision you've made since childhood? Or stared at your draft wondering why it reads more like a list of tasks than a clear explanation of how you conducted your study? Hey, co-authors. In this episode, we unpack why the method chapter feels so intimidating and show you how to transform it from a technical hurdle to a compelling story of your research decisions. We'll dig into the real pressures behind this chapter and reframe methods as a narrative that can bring clarity, coherence, and confidence to your work. Let's dive in. So I know that this is going to sound just a little bit nerdy, but I actually really love method sections of any research that I read or write because it's the first place in your work that really starts to showcase what you are adding to the conversation of whatever it is that you're going to study. Up until this point, you've really just been slogging through other people's work, reviewing it, summarizing and synthesizing those findings. And even though your literature review and introduction chapters are making an argument and are signaling to your reader how you are going to go beyond what we already know, the method chapter is where you start to assert what the process is by which you are going to be adding your unique contribution to the scholarly conversation on whatever subject it is that you're interested in. And so oftentimes, whether I'm reading a journal article or I'm reading a thesis or dissertation, I flip first to the methods section because in many ways, if the method has not been done well, if it has not been carefully designed, it has not been executed rigorously, then nothing else really matters, right? Like we can't trust your findings then, we can't trust your results if in your method section you are not communicating clearly about by which process you went about adding to our knowledge about your subject of investigation. And so if you go back in my podcast episodes, you'll see an episode on developing a methodology section for a qualitative research report. And so if you're interested in more of the nuts and bolts of setting up a method section, especially if you're doing qualitative work, but if you're doing any type of social science work, the structure that I've laid out there works pretty well. I encourage you to go back and listen to that episode because I think you'll find it really helpful. What I want to talk about today is not so much the technical aspect of what goes into the method section, but what it is that you're trying to accomplish in the method section and how through your method section you are able to develop a compelling narrative that shows your reader exactly why your research should be trusted, why they should go on to read the findings and the implications, and why ultimately they can rely on your research whenever they go to do their project. So let's dive in.
Are you interested in mastering scholarly writing, developing productivity, and increasing impact, all while staying healthy? Then welcome to the Publishing Academic Research Podcast. My name is Dr. Kyle Ruddick, and I'm a full professor and writing coach who's dedicated to making sure you break through whatever is stopping you from reaching your scholarly goals. I meet so many scholars who have creative, innovative, and daring ideas, but can never seem to get those projects from proposals to print. I want you to get your work in the hands of people who will read it and appreciate it. So let's get into this week's big idea.
So the first thing that I will say before I even get into the mistakes here is that I think it's most important to really think of is, do they want to have a methodology chapter or do they want to have a method chapter? And some people orient towards this differently, but the distinction that I make is a methodology chapter is a chapter that, in addition to detailing exactly what you did or will do in your thesis or dissertation, it will also have writing as to what the paradigmatic logic is that animates the choices that you've made methodologically. So if you're thinking a methodology chapter is really about the logic behind the method in addition to those nuts and bolts, whereas a straight method chapter is really the more prescriptive, here's the things that I did sort of stuff. I think that especially in dissertations, it's important to write the method chapter as a methodology chapter, primarily because I think that all too often, a lot of researchers, as they advance in their careers and they get more and more comfortable using a preferred set of methodological tools, that they become less and less able to defend the logic or the reasoning behind why they do the type of research that they do. And instead, most of their research is animated by the old saying, if all you got is a hammer, all the world's problems look like a nail. In this case, a lot of folks get trained in a particular set of methodological tools, would be that statistical, quantitative work, interpretive, qualitative work, critical ethnographic work, whatever it might be. And because they never really stop to think about, well, what's the logic or the reasoning behind this set of tools? What does it allow me to see and not see? And how can I, over the course of my career, be open and flexible to perhaps new ways of thinking about how to gather, treat, and ultimately make meaning of the data or text or whatever it is that you're studying for whatever project that you're working on. So I would say that if you're a doctoral student, you're working on your dissertation and you're working on your method chapter, maybe talk to your chair and see if you can write a methodology chapter, and then you write a little bit more about the logic that's really animating the type of work that you're doing. If you're writing a thesis as a master's student, my advice is always just to make it more simple. I mean, it's just, you have such a small window of time to get done that I would say that it's always preferable to err on the side of having less writing to do. Also, I mean, it's important on some level that you know some of the logic behind the things that you're doing. But honestly, if you're going to end your educational journey at a master's degree, I would say that if you walk out of that degree knowing how to use those tools well, that is a worthy goal for a master's student. It's really that more advanced study at the doctoral level that you start to learn about the logic behind it and then start to question and maybe even revise some of the logic that animates why we do the things that we do or how we do the things that we do. Whenever you're focusing then on the method section or your methodology section, whichever one you're doing, what's really the most important here is that you're conveying to your reader the logic of the choices that you made. And whether that is the more broad logic of, well, what does it mean to do interpretive work? What does it mean to do positivist work? What does it mean to do critical work? Like, what are the stakes in those conversations and how do they influence your methods? But even just at the level of, why did you choose interviews? Why did you choose this type of regression analysis? Why did you choose to talk to these folks instead of those folks? Like, every one of these things is a choice, and every choice has to be defended. And so the way that you can approach this is to ask yourself, as you're writing it, to think of it as a series of questions. Why did you choose this design? Why these participants? Why this type of data? Why this type of analysis? Oftentimes I see the lack of understanding about this in novice writers whenever at the very beginning they just don't understand like what types of questions are appropriate for what types of methods. So for example, I will teach a class in qualitative research or I'll be on a committee for a thesis or a dissertation that uses qualitative research designs. And then I'll get to the research question and it will be something like, how does the frequency of social media use among young adults influence their levels of perceived social isolation? So you look at that question and you're like, okay, that's a cause and effect question, right? Frequency of use influencing the levels of perceived isolation. That's an independent variable, social media use, and a dependent variable, perceived social isolation. And the fact that it says frequency, again, kind of indicates that we're going to be counting things, and levels, well, we can count that too. Okay, that's a quantitative question. That's not really a qualitative question. So at this point, you're not even asking a research question that methodologically you can do as a qualitative researcher. And so I then have to go back and explain, what can qualitative research do? What can it not do? Why are you asking this question? How can we reframe this as a qualitative question? Or do you need to go work with someone else because what you really want to be is a quantitative scholar? Like, you have to really think to yourself, what is it that I'm trying to get at here in this dynamic? And how do the tools that I have help me do that? And that requires you to have a clear logic for your reader in order for you to convey that information to them. The other thing I'll say is that it's really important in this story that you emphasize the coherence that you have from across your research. So what I mean by that is, to take my previous example, you have a research question that connects to or doesn't your research design, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, some sort of critical, rhetorical, whatever it might be. That design in turn tells you what your data or your text or your stuff can be. And that in turn tells you what your analysis can be. Like, each one of those are essential components to having a method or methodology section in your thesis or dissertation. So you really need to make sure that that story is flowing through your writing in order for you to convey to your reader that you had a coherent and planned approach to your study from the very beginning. So that being said, I've got 3 problems that I see folks who are writing their thesis or dissertation make whenever they're trying to convey this type of story to their readers about the coherence and rigor of their method or their methodology section of their thesis or dissertation. So first, and probably the most common, is that a lot of folks write this as just a log of this is what I did. And as a result, it reads very dry and very boring and very descriptive of the things that were accomplished or that they hope will be accomplished as they write their thesis or dissertation. And this makes complete sense, right? Like, you've done or will be doing this work. You want to show to your committee that you know what you're doing. And each one of these choices that you have, you want to be very explicit about each one of those. And so by no means is it wrong for you to add this information. But again, what's going to be just as important is why you did those things. And what I would say is what literature were you using in order for you to justify why you made those choices? So if I did interviews instead of focus groups, that's a choice. So why interviews? Why was one-on-one interviews preferable to having a focus group or an ethnography or an open-ended survey or anything else? And you don't have to go down the laundry list and say an interview is better than a focus group because, and an interview is better than an ethnography because. So what you're not doing is showing me why every other choice was inappropriate. Instead, you're just showing me why the choice you made was appropriate. And again, citing literature that helps you do that. So whenever you say, I'm doing an interview, well, what's an interview? According to who? What kind of interview? Was it structured, semi-structured, unstructured? Why was a highly structured interview the best choice for what you were trying to accomplish? What were its limitations? What were its benefits? All of those are questions that you need to be asking in the course of your method section. And so reframing, I think, this chapter, again, away from this is a laundry list of things that I did to instead, here are the things that I did and why they were the most appropriate, is the first step to writing a very compelling method section, because then it helps guide your reader from that research question to a logical flow through your method section of all the choices that you made and how those choices influenced ultimately your findings and your discussion. And so the second mistake that I oftentimes see is that sometimes reasons do appear, but they're very vague or they're unjustified. So for example, if I'm doing work that's quantitative in design and I'm using a theory that is itself from a paradigm of positivism or functionalism or however you want to call it, but it's one that's really reliant on the scientific method, then your design choices have to be consistent with what you're trying to do with that theory. Are you theory testing? Then you need to have a research design that allows you to actually do that. You need to have pre-test, post-test design. You need to have control group and experimental groups. You might need to have a placebo group, right? Like, there are all sorts of things that you need to do, and those have to be justified by showing how those choices influenced or ultimately led to the types of findings that you want to have. And so theoretical fit is one of those prescriptions. So what type of theory are you using? Are you testing that theory? Are you sense making with that theory? Are you sensitizing yourself to a particular type of dynamic? There should be congruence between what your method is, what you're trying to do, and the theories that are informing your work. The second thing is, and I've already kind of touched on this, but what kind of precedent is there in the literature for the type of work that you're doing? If people in your field are using a particular type of method, whether that's a certain type of statistical tool, certain type of research design, or whatever, then it's important for you to either show, hey, I'm doing that same thing because other people have done it too, and then cite appropriately as to why you think it's important that you do that too. Or if you're deviating from that, you need to say, other people have done this, I'm not going to, and here is another body of literature that I'm going to, as to why I think it's a better choice for me to do this instead of that. But either way, you are establishing a scholarly precedent as to why you are making the choices that you're making, and you're backing that up with citational evidence along the way. The third problem that I see, and this is particularly true, I think, in qualitative work that comes from a more critical cultural bent, but that is that I think a lot of researchers forget that they actually have a role as an interpreting subject in the research. A lot of the work that folks in my field and my particular specialty area are doing involves populations that are at risk because of their political status or their demographic status, their economic status, whatever it might be. And so whenever you as a researcher are going into those spaces, you need to write through, at the very least in your method section, but also in other places throughout your text, that really show your positionality and your interpretive choices. Minimally, you should be saying, you should be avoiding language like, in analyzing the data, 3 themes emerged. Okay, in analyzing data, who's doing the analyzing? That's passive voice. You are. 3 themes emerged. Emerged from where? They don't just spring out of nothing. You generated those themes. So really situating yourself as the interpreting subject in the language choices that you make are incredibly important, especially if you're doing any type of interpretive or critical cultural work. If you're doing more positivist, functionalist sort of quantitative work, you don't do that as much, primarily because the paradigmatic orientation of that type of work is that you're adhering to the scientific method and you are a neutral, objective observer by adhering to that scientific method. And so you might not have a positionality statement if you're doing that type of scholarship. Whether that's good, bad, or indifferent is the subject of an ethics and research class. But for the purpose of this, we're going to say that's okay because that's what your paradigmatic orientation is. But especially if you're doing interpretive, critical, or cultural work, you need to be showing how your positionality is a part of your interpretive choice. That's not the same thing as I'm going to show these things. I'm going to lay out my positionality in the hope of convincing my reader that I was actually a neutral person in this, that I'm credible because I've been objective. It's not the point here, because those paradigms don't believe in objectivity. And so instead, what you are trying to do is situate your voice as a credible voice of reinterpreting people's experiences through scholarly analysis. But that's not the same thing as saying, and so I'm a detached, neutral observer. So having a section that you call reflexivity or positionality statement or whatever it is that your particular field or discipline does is going to be an important part of the methodological voice and the methodological choices that you're making as you write your thesis or your dissertation. Now, I will say, what you're not trying to do here is write a memoir or write an autoethnography or an autobiography or anything else, especially things like autoethnography. That's a research method all on its own. It's a completely different thing, and it's got its own assumptions and its own way of doing things. If you're doing that type of work, you may not even have like a formal method section or methodology chapter. But especially if you're doing the type of work that lends itself to this type of writing and this type of organization, it's important for you to, instead of trying to hide bias or hide your positionality, instead being forthright about those things and then writing through that space. So overall, what I would say is that as you're working on this project, it's important for you to think about all the things that you need to hit in order to convince your reader, again, through a scholarly, coherent narrative, that what you've done here is not just the choices that you made, but the best choices that could have been made, given your time, resources, and constraints for the type of work and knowledge claims that you're trying to do. So you need to convey to them what the purpose of this research is, what its design is, what constitutes the data, text, stuff that you're looking at, what your procedures for gathering that data, text, or stuff might be, how you analyze those things, and then finally those ethics and reflexivity statements. All those things together help your reader come to know why the things that you did were the best choices that could be made in this particular instance, and that we can rely on your work as adding to the scholarly conversation about whatever it is that you're studying. I just want to say that a method section, especially for a thesis or dissertation, it's not really about having the perfect research design. Instead, it is about creating a coherent, credible narrative to your reader about what you're trying to do. As I'm sure you've heard the old saying, a done thesis or a done dissertation, that's a good one, right? Here, again, you are going to be running into the Scylla and Charybdis, the rock and the hard place between having all of these ideas, all of these ambitions, all of this stuff that you want to accomplish, and the reality of the resources and time that you have in order to get things done. And it's in the nexus of those two things that you're going to find your research project. And so being able to convince your reader that this was the best way to do it comes from that logical structure. So that's going to about wrap it up for me, folks. Just a couple things as I finish. First off, this is part 5 of a 10-part series on writing your thesis or dissertation. So if you haven't gotten a chance, there's other episodes that are out. There's more that are going to be coming. I hope to cover the whole thing and hopefully get you all some really good advice to get you on your way and get you successful in whatever projects that you're trying to accomplish. Second, I'm trying out a new audio setup. And look, I'll just be honest. I'm just some dude with a microphone. I have no formal background in being an audio tech or any of these other things. This is all just kind of a labor of love for me. I don't really have a whole lot of background in this area, but I would appreciate it if you like the new audio. Shoot me a message on LinkedIn As always, I appreciate any feedback that you can give on the podcast because I really want to make sure that this is the best resource for you. I'm also going to continue making episodes about writing and research after this particular series is done. So if there's something that you want me to talk about, whether in a single episode or maybe even dedicating multiple episodes to it, let me know. Again, my contact information's in the podcast description. Look me up on LinkedIn. Shoot me a message, reach out to me, email me, whatever it might be, so that way I can continue to improve and give you all the best information. Okay? So thank you again, and I will see you in next week's episode.
Hey, co-authors, what's stopping your best ideas from becoming your next big publication? Brilliant research shouldn't die in your drafts folder. Now's the time to bridge the gap between the possible and the published. You can support this podcast by subscribing to it, leaving a positive review, assigning it to your classes, or sharing it with a colleague. Let me know what I can do to make this the best podcast resource for you. And if you'd like to know more about my writing coach services, then you can find my information in the podcast description and set up an appointment. I'll be back next week with another episode. But until then, keep healthy, keep writing, and don't let reviewer 2 get you down.